Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm continuing on with my discussion on Rupert's Land, this making it part 7 in that series. I'm quoting from, to begin with, a Time Life book from 1977 called The Canadians, and I'd like to point this quote out to begin with. These two very different groups of men, the enterprising Scots and the perdurable French, were the adventurers of the Canadian West. They explored and mapped the labyrinthine waterways, the rugged mountains of the far west, the fertile south central plains, and the bleak tundra of the Arctic North. They planted the first permanent western settlements, their crude little trading posts, and established the Canadian policy of peaceful cooperation with the Indians. They were the first rulers of Canada's West. Their companies, the only form of organization on the early frontier, necessarily served as local governments. All this the fur traders accomplished long before the Americans broached their virgin West. Now, of course, what they're ignoring in this is the fact that the law of the land, the law of the Indigenous nations. Then it was, when you read these kinds of history comments about what the voyageurs were doing, etc., it's written and makes it sound like they discovered, they mapped out these things, they found them themselves. But what's pretty rare to find, and it is in this Time Life book, is this acknowledgement, and in the map here I'm posting so that you can actually see what they were doing. The voyageurs' artery to the heartland. When the voyageurs set forth in search of beaver, they traveled a route that had been used by Indians for centuries. So they did not, make this path themselves. It already existed. Why? Because the Indians, the Indigenous nationals, were busy trading. I mean, if you look at all of the major arteries that form highways today, they're all originally quote-unquote Indian trails, Indian paths. And this is really the first time that I've come across a reference to acknowledge that in any kind of serious effort at history. And that's important, right? Because they're acknowledging here, the Indians have been trading for centuries. They've been using this. They didn't go out and create this, the voyageurs, the Scotch and the French. They actually just followed the Indians, right? And it's important to know that during this time, there was no lawful ability to settle the lands. It was necessary to first put the interests of the Hudson's Bay Company back in the hands of the Crown, so that the Crown could then use Canada in terms of proceeding with settlement, right? It's very clear. This is, the Canadian government accepted an invitation to be represented in this investigation in the early part of the year 1857. The committee reported to the effect that terms should be agreed upon between the company, that's the Hudson's Bay Company, and the Imperial and Canadian governments in order that the territory might be made available for settlement. Might be made available for settlement. It could only become available for settlement should the Crown conclude treaties with the owners of the land, which indeed transpired. No selling of the land. These treaties were for purposes of settlement. And you hear this from so many elders and reflecting on what they know of the situation, what they heard firsthand from those who were present, and the representations, for example, of Commissioner Morris, that we're not here to buy your land, we're here to borrow it. We're going to take care of it for you. These kinds of things. Well, that's all terminology. That's a lease, right? That's a lesser interest than ownership. An acknowledgement that the Indigenous nations remain the owners. And you see it written up in the treaties, to have and to hold. You do not find those terms, which are specific legal terms, the habitum and the tenentum clauses. You don't see that when, for example, there have been treaties where, in Europe, for example, that through wars, they were, giving and taking property between them. They don't use those terms. It was a different approach. It was this approach of cooperation. The relationship between the Crown and the Indigenous nations always commenced on a commercial basis, on trade, and it carried on and continued. And Crown said, look, I need to be able to have some more land where I can allow my people to settle. And in doing so, in granting those permissions and the partial political sovereignty that results from that, the Indigenous nations in no way did they give up what they still have and what they still have today. That's all I have to say.